In this video, I'm going to show you how to place the parking brake shoes on this Ford F-350. They're located right behind your rear brakes. We'll have to take those apart to get to these. Let's get started. Let's remove the wheel. Sometimes these wheels have some center caps, so you're going to want to use a pry bar or screwdriver to pop that off before you get to the lug nuts. Usually if you just look around, there's going to be a cutout at some point that you can use to pry out on. And that exposes your 8 21mm headed lug nuts, so let's take those off. With those off, remove the wheel and set it aside. Let's remove the caliper and bracket assembly. We're going to remove the 2 21mm headed bolts that hold this onto the rear axle. These might be difficult to reach because of clearance here, so use a swivel socket with a power tool or break them free with a breaker bar and then remove them by hand. Leave this one in a few threads so it can hold this on while we remove the top one. Take that out, remove the caliper and bracket assembly with the pads right off of the rotor. I don't want to put pressure on this brake hose, so I don't want to hang it by it, but what I do have is a bungee cord, so I can hang it on that right behind the shock absorber. And now remove the rotor. Sometimes it's stuck on here. Mine's new, so it's not going to be stuck, but if yours is, you can hit the side of it with a hammer. That should help break it free without damaging the braking surface or potentially hitting the studs or the threads of them if you're hitting right here. All right, on the side, on each shoe, you'll see this spring clip with a pin going through it. My pin is actually not attached to the backing plate, and that's why it's loose, but regardless, you're gonna do the same thing to loosen it up and unhook it really. You're gonna twist this spring off and remove it, and then you can push the pin through and remove that. Mine is stuck here just because it's jammed in where it is, so I'm gonna have to take it off with the shoe, but you can remove your pin and do the same to the other shoe. A little bit hard to see right here, but there's a spring and then our adjuster. Let's pop the spring off, which actually sometimes can be easier if we not only close up this adjuster, but remove it completely. So let's grab a pry bar. All right. All right, take that out. Inspect all these items that you remove. We're going to reuse the hardware. I'll show you how to loosen that adjuster up and lubricate it. For now, let's remove the shoes. Taking these off, you can easily use a pry bar. Pry them out of their slot at the top. That will loosen tension on the spring, and then you can remove the other shoe. And there they are. Twist them apart to get the spring off. The spring is in great shape. There's your shoes. At the top, you have this parking brake lever, which needs to pivot smoothly, and mine is seized. Now it moves this way. That's normal. It's just pivoting on the cable. It needs to pivot this way. So I'm going to soak it down in some rust penetrant. This is very common for it to seize up, especially if you do not use your parking brake, and this is not lubricated properly. I'm going to let this soak for a little bit, and then use a hammer and a punch or a chisel and tap it one way and then tap it the other way. Now in more severe cases, you're gonna have to remove it from the parking brake cable, put it in a vise and use a bigger hammer on it. Hopefully though, being mounted in here and me chiseling it back and forth will break it free. Usually that does the trick most times. Once you got it to a point where this can pivot just with your fingers. That's loose enough. That's what it should be doing, just like this. So at this point, we're going to clean this out, blow it out with compressed air if you have that, or rinse it with brake parts cleaner, whatever you have to get all that rust and debris out of there, and then I'll show you how to lubricate it properly. All right, this is how it should be working. This part should stay flat up against the backing plate, and that should pivot around it. I'm going to take some high temperature silicone paste that is rated for brakes. This area gets hot, so you don't want anything that's going to melt. You can also use some brake grease and stick it in right where this pivots, and then we'll work it back and forth to ensure proper long-term operation and lubrication of this lever. I'm going to apply some right back here where it rubs up against the backing shield so it doesn't squeak or make any sorts of noises. Now that is perfect. Let's prepare the backing shield for some parking brake shoes, and these little divots or bumps that it has here are actually where you want to apply some brake grease or high temperature silicone paste that is rated for brakes, and that is so that the parking brake shoes don't squeak when they go on and operate. I'm also going to put some silicone paste right where they sit at the top. That way, once again, they don't squeak, but also they won't seize over time. I'm going to do the same to the other side of this shield, and then we'll install them. To break this adjuster free, as you can see right here, it's perfectly clean, but right here, the threads are rusted and they're stuck to this wheel that basically spins and adjusts everything. So I'm going to put this end in my vise, spray it down with some rust penetrant, and use some pliers on this and try to get it to break free, spin it back and forth, and get it past these threads that are rusted. And then I'm going to be able to take this off completely and clean the threads. Put some of that same brake grease or silicone paste right on the threads over here and work that into the threads. That way, well, it doesn't seize in the future. Take this little star wheel and bring it in all the way. Not only does it have to be like that when we install it, but it helps to work that grease into the threads, like I said. There we go. And apply some on the very end so that all of the threads can be properly coated. Put these two halves back together, and this is now ready to be installed. It's time to install the shoes, and I'm going to make sure that the smaller cutout is at the top with this rectangular cutout for where the spring goes. Now what you want to do is take the spring and make sure that the hook part is facing towards the back of the shoe as well as pointing down so that it can hook in to this cutout and sit flat up against it. If you look from the back side, it'll have to follow the curvature of this shoe. Now you take the other shoe and you do the same thing, hook it in, and now we'll have to stretch this over the top and actually install the shoes. This part will be quite tricky. Be very careful of pinch points so you don't hurt yourself. All right, so I got it seated. Obviously the shoes want to come off of here. They're pulling away. That's normal. The spring is under quite a bit of tension. Now what you want to make sure is that everything is fully seated here. So grab a screwdriver, pry bar, pry on things, make sure that it is in position, because that will make it easier to install the rest of your hardware. Everything is seated on this lever. It's okay if it doesn't touch this top mounting point here. So let's grab the pins and lock the shoes in. Stick the pin through the backing shield and through the shoe. And for these, because they're a hook style, what I found easiest, if you put a little bit of grease right on the end of the clip here, that's actually going to make it easier to hook it on. Okay, make sure that's fully seated, and then we'll do the same to the other side shoe. Let's put in the spring and, of course, the adjuster at the bottom. The spring goes into a couple little cutouts that are right at the base here where it's a little bit difficult to see. So I'm going to put that in first because it's easier to push these shoes together to get the spring hooked on, and then I can just use a pry bar to separate them to get the adjuster in. The adjuster is lubricated and it's ready to go, and it is not directional because this doesn't self-adjust like drum brakes. It doesn't really matter which way you put it in. So slide it on, pry these shoes apart. There we go. Make sure the adjuster is fully seated. At this point, it is completely collapsed. The shoes are as close as they can possibly be, and that's where you want to start with when you have new shoes so that you can adjust them correctly. So at this point, let's put the rotor over, and this is where you're going to make your adjustment until everything is adjusted correctly. Slide the rotor on, and let's check for the adjustment of the shoes. Okay, I can hear them touch a little bit. So that's a good sign. However, what I will do now is apply the parking brake, and that will actually seat the shoes evenly left and right. Then we'll try again, because sometimes after you apply the parking brake, they are most likely going to have less contact once they've centered themselves up. A quick way to do this is to just go on the back side and pull on that lever with a pry bar that actuates the parking brakes instead of going up into the vehicle and applying the actual parking brake pedal. I am no longer hearing the shoes just like I thought. What I'm actually hearing is the other side. So I'm going to pull this back off, increase the distance on my adjuster just a little bit. A small adjustment goes a long way here, and then we'll try the same thing again. Okay, I can hear them touch just a little bit. That's exactly what you want from parking brake shoes. You don't want to hear them drag. You don't want to have resistance on the rotor. For these, they just have to be very close so that when you apply that parking brake pedal, they only have to expand a little bit until they catch and hold the vehicle. So I'm going to leave it adjusted as is. However, we have to pull the rotor back out to cover the hub in some anti-seize so it doesn't go on dry with no corrosion protection. With the hub nice and clean, apply some anti-seize to the surface so that you don't have corrosion building up. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs and of course also the parking brake shoes. And you want to keep it a nice thin layer because if you put too much, it's actually going to squish out when the rotor goes on and it's going to start flinging on the area where the parking brake shoes ride, and you don't want that to happen. Take your rotor and slide it on. To make sure it stays seated in place and doesn't move around, I'm going to put 2 lug nuts on and bottom them out gently. Take the caliper and slide it over the rotor. And put in your 2 bolts that mount it onto the axle. The torque on both of these bolts is 203 foot-pounds. All right, that's tight. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 8 lug nuts. We'll bottom them out in a cross pattern, and also in a cross pattern, torque them to 165 foot-pounds. Once again, 165 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Double check them if you want. And then of course, if your vehicle had these lug nut covers, go ahead and put these back on, line them up, tap them on, and there you have it. Don't forget to top off the master cylinder, pump up the brake pedal, and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.